The Powassan virus had already reached Daniel Reyes's brainstem before anyone in that Wisconsin ICU knew how to pronounce its name. It had all started on a Saturday morning, clearing brush along the tree line that borders his farm, the same routine chore he'd done hundreds of times. A tick latched onto his neck for 15 minutes. Now this 42-year-old cattleman, a guy who could ID every tick species in Sawyer County on site, had been on a ventilator for 22 days while a neurologist stared at an MRI showing his brainstem lit up like a highway flare. No bullseye rash, no tick saved in a jar. His Lyme panel had been run twice, negative both times, and both times the result was correct. There's a virus that can travel from a tick's saliva into your bloodstream in the time it takes you to finish a cup of coffee, and most doctors in this country have never diagnosed it once in their entire careers. What nobody in that ICU could answer yet was why that virus was named after a small Canadian town where, back in 1958, a 4-year-old boy died and no one could figure out what had killed him. 22 days before the ICU, Daniel Reyes was a 42-year-old dairy farmer in rural Sawyer County, Wisconsin. He had a wife named Elena, 2 kids, a 9-year-old daughter and a 6-year-old son, and a routine as fixed as the seasons. Milking at 4:30, breakfast at 7. Fence lines checked every Saturday when the weather allowed. He had grown up on that land. He knew what lived on it. He also knew ticks. In 2016, Daniel had been diagnosed with Lyme disease after a tick sat on his calf for what he estimated was 2 full days during hay season. Doxycycline. Full recovery. But the memory left a mark. Since then, he had become, in Elena's words, a fanatic about the check. Pants tucked into socks. Long sleeves in summer heat. A full-body inspection every night in the mudroom mirror, no matter how late. If you had asked Daniel Reyes what he feared in his own woods, he would have told you without hesitation, the tick that got away. What he did not fear, because he had never heard of it, was the tick that only needed 15 minutes. That Saturday morning in early October, the air smelled of damp oak leaves and wet loam. Elena poured him coffee. He took it in the enamel mug she had bought him for their 10th anniversary. Their daughter, Sophia, was already at the kitchen table in her pajamas, drawing a cow in crayon. Daniel kissed the top of her head. Picture that scene. A farmer, his coffee, his daughter's drawing. Nothing in that kitchen was warning anyone. Mark Halverson was already in the truck by 6. Daniel's oldest friend, his hunting partner since high school, a man built like a fence post and just as talkative. They were not hunting that morning. They were clearing brush from a stand Daniel had inherited from his father, in a stretch of woodland where the town of Hayward gives way to the Chequamegon National Forest. Elena remembers standing on the porch and watching the truck's taillights disappear past the mailbox. She remembers thinking it was a beautiful morning. They worked through it. Chainsaws, gloves, sweat. Around 10:30, Daniel felt something on his neck, just above his collar. He reached up and pinched between his thumb and forefinger. A tick. Small. Not engorged. Barely there. He estimated later, when doctors pressed him, that it had been on him for maybe 15 minutes, maybe less. He had felt it almost immediately. He flicked it off into the leaf litter. He did not save it. He did not photograph it. He had been bitten 100 times before. He zipped his jacket and got back to work. Sit with that for a second. A man who checks himself obsessively, a man who knows every rule about tick-borne disease, and the very fastidiousness that had protected him for years, the immediate detection, the immediate removal, was, for this particular virus, completely irrelevant, because the rule he had memorized, the 36-hour rule printed on every state health department pamphlet in the upper Midwest, applied to a bacterium, not to what was now in his bloodstream. Mark got bitten that same weekend. His tick attached low on his back, out of sight, and stayed there for the better part of a day. 3 days later, Mark developed the textbook bullseye rash. The erythema migrans, started a course of doxycycline, and was entirely fine by the following week. Remember Mark, his name will come back. For the next 6 days, nothing happened. Then the first symptom arrived, and it did not look like anything Daniel had ever had before. Day 6. The headache started behind Daniel's right eye while he was fixing a fence line. He drank a bottle of water and kept working. Hay season had been brutal. The fall harvest was late, and he had been running on 5 hours of sleep for 2 weeks. A dull ache behind the eye seemed like a bill coming due. On day 8, the headache had not lifted. Elena drove him to the clinic in town. The physician assistant took his vitals, listened to his chest, ran through the checklist. No fever, no stiff neck, no rash. Daniel mentioned the tic, almost as a formality, because Elena elbowed him to say it. The PA drew a lime titer as a precaution and sent him home with ibuprofen and a note to drink more water. Have you ever done that? Written off a headache because you were tired, because the harvest was late, because you did not want to be the kind of man who complained? At that moment, according to what the neurologists would later have you been in wooded country in the last month. Any tick bites, even brief ones? Even ones that came off right away? Elena answered before Daniel could. Yes. 3 weeks ago, he flicked one off his neck. He said it was on him for 15 minutes. He didn't save it. Doctor, Chen turned to the neurology resident standing beside her. She did not raise her voice. She said, order a lumbar puncture, order arbovirus serology on the CSF, and specifically request Powassan. Then she sat down on the edge of the gurney and explained to Elena what she suspected in the kind of plain sentences a person uses when they know the news is going to break the listener. The diagnosis, when the polymerase chain reaction came back 36 hours later, was Powassan virus encephalitis, lineage 2, the deer tick virus subtype. Here's what that name means. Powassan for the town in Ontario where in 1958, a 4-year-old boy named Lincoln Byers died of an unexplained brain inflammation and became the first documented human case. Encephalitis, from the Greek en, meaning within, kephale, meaning head, and itis, meaning inflammation. Inflammation within the head. Put more plainly, Daniel's brain was on fire, and the fire had a name. Now stay with me, because the mechanism of this virus is the reason none of the earlier doctors had a chance. Powassan is a flavivirus, the only tick-borne flavivirus native to North America. It is a cousin at the molecular level of West Nile and Japanese encephalitis and yellow fever, and it lives critically in the salivary glands of the tick. Not the gut, the saliva. This is the part that changes everything. The bacterium that causes Lyme disease, Borrelia burgdorferi, lives in the tick's midgut. When a tick begins to feed, that bacterium has to migrate from the gut, up through the tick's body, into the salivary glands, and then into the human host. That migration takes, on average, 36 to 48 hours. Which is why every pamphlet Daniel had ever read told him he had a day and a half to find a tick before it mattered. Powassan does not need to migrate. It is already there. In the saliva. Ready. Experiments at the New York State Department of Health have shown that nymphal deer ticks can transmit Powassan to naive mice in as little as 15 minutes of attachment. 15 minutes. There is no grace period. There is no window. The moment the tick's mouthparts pierce the skin, the transmission clock is already at 0. Now picture what was happening inside Daniel's body while he drove home that Saturday afternoon feeling fine. The virus entered the skin at the bite site. It infected the sentinel immune cells of the epidermis, replicated and rode local lymphatics into the bloodstream. And then, somewhere between day 6 and day 13, it did the thing that separates Powassan from most other viruses the human body will ever encounter. It crossed the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is a wall of tightly joined endothelial cells lining the brain's blood vessels, designed to keep almost everything out. Powassan crosses it. Once inside the central nervous system, the virus lytically infects neurons, meaning it enters the cell, replicates, and bursts the cell open, killing it. Autopsies of Powassan patients have shown lesions concentrated in the cerebellum, the brainstem, the basal ganglia, and the thalamus. the structures that govern balance, breathing, movement, and the sorting of every sensory signal you receive. The lumbar puncture showed a white blood cell count in the cerebrospinal fluid of 370 per microliter, 80% mononuclear cells. A normal count is 0 to 5. 370 versus 5. The protein was elevated. The glucose was normal, which ruled out bacterial meningitis. Every number in that panel said viral encephalitis. The specific serology said Powassan. The neurologist hung up the phone and turned to Elena. "It is Powassan. There is no antiviral." The room went quiet. Elena did not cry this time either. She asked what came next. According to CDC surveillance data, from 2004 through 2013, only 64 cases of Powassan virus were reported in the United States. From 2014 through 2023, that number jumped to 270. In 2025, the CDC recorded 76 cases in a single year, the highest annual total ever documented. 64 cases in a decade, then 270 in the next, then 76 in a single year. That is not a plateau. That is a curve. Roughly 1 to 2% of black-legged ticks in the endemic zones of the upper Midwest and Northeast carry Powassan, compared to the 20 to 30% that carry the Lyme bacterium. Rarer in ticks, yes, but when it transmits fast and hits hard. About 1 in 10 patients with neuroinvasive Powassan disease die. Roughly half of the survivors are left with permanent neurological damage, memory loss, motor deficits, chronic headaches, speech impairment, muscle wasting. The discharge planning notes from Daniel's Rice Lake emergency room visit, subpoenaed later during a hospital quality review, stated that the patient presented with acute onset diplopia and dysarthria and was discharged in stable condition pending outpatient neurology follow-up. What those notes did not say, what they could not have said, because nobody in that room had asked the right question, was that Daniel Reyes had, at that exact moment, live viral RNA replicating in the neurons of his brainstem, already deep into the second phase of a two-phase disease. Elena and Daniel's brother Miguel now had 48 hours to decide whether to transfer him to the tertiary care center in Madison, 240 miles south, and what nobody had told them yet was that the window for that decision was almost certainly already closing. The plan was straightforward and almost entirely inadequate. Transfer to Madison ventilator, high VIG, methylprednisolone. Seizure control with midazolam. There was nothing else to offer. Consider what would have happened if Dr. Chen had not been on shift that night. If the third emergency room had, like the first two, sent Daniel home with a follow-up appointment. Consider the alternative timeline documented in the medical literature, published in Brown Hospital Medicine, of a 39-year-old woman from upstate New York who presented with almost identical symptoms after a tick bite 10 days prior. She was discharged from an emergency department once. She returned. She seized. She was intubated. Her Powassan PCR came back positive as the transfer team was preparing to move her. A brain perfusion study performed at the receiving hospital showed no blood flow to the brain. She was extubated terminally. Her family made the decision in a hallway. That was the timeline Daniel was on. The one where the diagnosis comes 2 weeks late instead of 2 days late. The one where the family gets the phone call in a hallway instead of the transfer. Day 21. Daniel opened his eyes in the Madison ICU and looked at Elena. He did not speak, but he tracked her face across the room. Day 23. Aspiration pneumonia. His temperature climbed to 103.8. The intensivist adjusted antibiotics and adjusted the ventilator settings and told Elena, gently, that setbacks were expected. Day 27. Daniel said Sophia's name. It came out slurred and thick. Elena wept for the first time since the ambulance. She had been saving it. Remember Mark? His tick had stayed on him for close to a day. His body had produced the textbook rash, the ring, the visible warning. because Borrelia takes its time and gives you a sign. Mark took his doxycycline. He was back at work in a week. He came to the Madison ICU with a casserole and cried in the hallway because he had gotten the visible warning and his best friend had gotten 15 minutes of nothing. Everything Daniel had done right did not matter. The pants tucked into socks, the mirror check every night, the fingernail flick, the immediate removal. All of it was calibrated for a disease that gives you 36 hours to catch it. This virus gave him 15 minutes, and the 15 minutes were already gone by the time he felt the itch. 14 months after the bite, Daniel Reyes walks with a cane along the north pasture if someone walks with him. He cannot read a full page of text without losing the thread. The fine motor control in his left hand is gone. He cannot button his own shirt. He forgets the names of the cows he raised from calves. He milks with help. He still farms. Sophia, now 10, reads to him in the evenings from the books he used to read to her. And Daniel is not alone. Daniel Reyes lived in Sawyer County, Wisconsin, right in the bullseye of the region epidemiologists have been circling on their maps for 15 years. But the map has shifted, and most of the doctors who treated him still had the old version in their heads. For the first 4 decades after Lincoln Byers' case in 1958, Powassan was essentially an Ontario problem, hugging the northern edge of the Great Lakes. 25 cases in 40 years. A virological curiosity confined to a narrow band of temperate forest. The virus circulated in ticks of the species Ixodes cucae, which mostly bites groundhogs and chipmunks, and almost never crawls onto a human. The risk was real but contained, because the vector preferred another host. What changed was the second lineage. The sublineage 2 virus, the one that infected Daniel, circulates in Ixodes scapularis, the black-legged tick, the same species that transmits Lyme disease, babesiosis, and anaplasmosis. And the black-legged tick has spent 3 decades pushing steadily south and west, driven by shorter winters, the rebound of the white-tailed deer as an adult host, and habitat fragmentation that puts forest edges within 50 yards of suburban backyards. In 1998, the black-legged tick was endemic in 16 states. By 2023, the United States Geological Survey documented it as established in roughly half the continental country. About 2% of black-legged ticks in the high-density zones of the Northeast and Upper Midwest test positive for Powassan. Not Lyme, which runs somewhere between 20 and 30%, Powassan. But 2% of a vector that has tripled its range in 25 years is not the same absolute risk it was in 1998. That explains the jump from 64 reported cases between 2004 and 2013 to 270 between 2014 and 2023. It's not just better diagnostics. It's that the vector is showing up in places it never was, and the people who live there have no mental model for that risk, because when they moved in, that risk didn't exist. What no Wisconsin state pamphlet had ever explained to Daniel Reyes, and what nobody had explained to the 2 emergency room doctors who saw him before Dr. Chen, is that the current map in his pocket was already the wrong map. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention logged 1 case of Powassan per year in the United States from 1958 through 2005. In 2025, they logged 76. 10% of neuroinvasive cases end in death. 50% of survivors are left with permanent neurological damage. The difference between a diagnosis at 6 days and a diagnosis at 6 months is, in this disease, the difference between walking your daughter down the aisle and forgetting her middle name. Here's the rule. If you live, work, or travel in the Northeast, the Great Lakes, or the Upper Midwest between May and October, any tick bite of any duration deserves the same response. Photograph the tick if you can. Seal it in a plastic bag and put it in the freezer. And for the next 5 weeks, if you develop a headache, fever, double vision, slurred speech, or confusion, tell every doctor you see. Say the word Powassan out loud, even if you feel fine right now, especially if the contact was brief. In the opening scene of this story, Daniel Reyes was in his Wisconsin kitchen and kissed his daughter Sophia on the head before heading out to the truck. 14 months later, Sophia is sitting in a chair in the Madison ICU holding her father's hand. The same hand. The same fingernail that flicked a tick off his neck in the leaf litter of Sawyer County. The same hand that can no longer button his shirt. Lyme has the 36-hour rule. Powassan has the 15-minute rule. Both rules are true. Only one of them was on the pamphlet in the campground bathroom. Medicine does not fail on what it doesn't know. It fails on what it takes for granted. This is Shocking Medical Cases,